All right, it is time for my GameStop Retro Store trip report. That's right, I've seen that that's the thing to do, and I do enjoy watching them, so I figured I'd create one as well. I took a look on the GameStop website, where you can, in fact, get the location of your nearest retro-themed GameStop. There's one in Jacksonville, Florida. That's within a reasonable driving distance of me, so I figured I'd jump in the car yesterday afternoon and head on down and see what's doing. I gotta tell you, if you're looking for a stereotypical response that's poo-pooing GameStop, you're going to be a little bit disappointed, but perhaps intrigued at my findings. The first thing I noticed when I went into the store was that the fellow that was working there was incredibly friendly, very professional, very helpful, asked me what I was interested in. I mentioned I was looking for the retro stuff and immediately kind of apologized for the relative lack of selection as they've kind of just got started, pointed me to the area of the store where the stuff is set up. And I have to tell you, while I appreciate the kind words or the apologetic tone, there was actually a relatively healthy selection of stuff there already. Again, I appreciate that. I wandered on over and saw a pretty good selection of stuff. I mean, I admit I was almost just expecting to see a bunch of kind of junky, common Xbox 360 and PS3 games, but that was not the case here. There was obviously, yes, a decent number of Xbox 360 and PS3 stuff, but there were other things as well. There were some PS2 games. There was a number of boxed, believe it or not, 3DS things. There was a lot of Wii stuff in there. There was actually a original OG Game Boy game, a Final Fantasy game. That was pleasantly surprising to see. There were any number of different platforms represented on the shelves. In addition to platforms, they had a few accessories as well. One of which that I felt the need to pick up was an OG first-party NES controller. Now, we're not talking about the controllers for the NES Classic. We're talking about the actual old-school 80s controller for the original NES, and this thing was actually very clean and nicely bundled up. It was for $10, a sale price apparently, but still, $10 for a nice, clean, original NES controller is not bad at all. So I felt the need to check it out, and I will give you a little bit of a spoiler. It works great. So I feel like I had a very good deal on that. But anyhow, some other accessories like Wii nunchucks and things of that nature. So quite the good selection to get us going. Now, one thing I'm going to make a note, because the implication when you read about the GameStop Retro is that, okay, so there's certain locations that now carry this material and you don't really have to ask around. I think I made the analogy in a previous video that like one of my laments about the GameStop Retro hunting was you're almost like you're going to a pharmacy looking for dirty magazines. You have to ask behind the counter, and you would think that you don't have to do that anymore. There's one exception that I've found, and that's for cartridge-based games. See, the problem they have is I don't think they have a good solution for displaying actual cartridge games without them being inevitably stolen off the shelves. You can't really just put the cartridges on the shelves. It's just the world we live in. I hate to say it. They don't really fit cleanly into the little Game Boy cases there. So those are still behind the counter, and you still do have to go and ask to see them. So just as a note to everyone, when you're hunting, be sure to ask at the counter if they could take the cartridges out to show you. In my case, they did have a couple of N64 games available. They weren't games that I collected, but it was interesting to see. They looked clean. They looked to be in good shape. So, circling back, again, I want to sing the highest praises I can of the fellow that was working there at the Jacksonville GameStop on, in case GameStop is watching, on Saturday afternoon, August 31st. Whoever this fellow is, give him a pat on the back and clone him, because not only was he very knowledgeable, but he proactively asked what types of retro games they'd like to see in the store more often. Of course, I immediately said, well, I'm a card-carrying AARP member, fella. I'd like some more cartridge games, please. At which point, that's when he actually informed me that there were some cartridges behind the counter and understanding the reasoning why. I did, in some small talk, as I was paying for my controller, ask a little more about the program. Was interested to see if they had any special training. He piped up immediately, said, absolutely. absolutely. There's been training being given to all the employees in the retro stores. They have GameBit devices to open cartridges. They know the difference between, for example, a fake NES or SNES cartridge PCB versus the authentic item. I thought that was really cool. So I legitimately left feeling that, at least in the Jacksonville store, I won't speak for the entire chain. Obviously, your mileage may vary in terms of the interest level that individual employees have and the participation and their investment in the success of this program. But at least in this store, you could tell they were really making a very good effort to get things right, to do things better, and to make it successful. They were also enthusiastic about getting inventory from other non-retro stores. So that was pretty cool. And he also printed out for me, when I asked about specific NES games, a list of all of the NES games that GameStop deals with, either buying or selling. And it's kind of an interesting list. It's a weird, kind of almost random selection of titles from the NES library. Some that you would have expected to be on the list were missing. Some that you wouldn't have expected to be on the list were there. It's kind of strange, but nonetheless, was very happy to volunteer information when asked. In no way, shape, or form dodged any of my questions. So again, I can't praise enough the employees of this store. Now, my thoughts about this program. While my sample size, again, is one store, and I'm optimistic for my local GameStop, I still think there are some things that GameStop needs to improve and think about when making their, V3, V4 of this initiative work correctly. And I think the first thing they need to look at is, quite frankly, protecting themselves. We live in a world where there are a lot of dishonest people. As much as I would love to say we live in a high-trust society, we sadly do not. And that is not just on the side of buyers, it's on the side of sellers like GameStop. There's nothing stopping an unscrupulous person from buying, for example, a counterfeit copy of a cartridge that's high dollar value from nefarious sources and trading it into the GameStop, or at least trying to trade it in to get the $35 max credit for the cartridge from GameStop. Now, even though those GameStops may be opening cartridges up and checking the insides, there's nothing stopping someone from getting cheap common games like Top Gun, hoarding them, and simply swapping the games, the game PCBs. And I say that because I don't believe that any of these GameStops yet have the capability or the process to use an actual NES deck or even a clone console to go beyond just looking at the contents of the PCB, but actually putting the game in a system and testing it. So there is still sort of an honor system at play in terms of, yes, a visual inspection, but not an authentication. I say that because, heck, that's what happened back in 2018 when I went to buy a Bubble Bobble 2 cart from the then GameStop Retro online site. And while the label was clearly laughable, there was actually the game PCB from F-15 Strike Eagle in there. So I do think that GameStop needs to beef up their security measures even more if they want to protect themselves from a massive wave of seller fraud, which I believe, while they won't admit it, I'm of the opinion that that's ultimately what sank their previous initiatives, getting drowned in losses from basically fraud. And, another note about GameStop protecting its interests here. I know this might be a little bit into the spicy take zone, but I'm going to do it anyway. I think that GameStop needs to take a step further in protecting themselves from getting counterfeit goods traded in. I'd go so far as to say they might want to consider, for the retro trades, adopting what I'll call like a pawn shop store sort of policy. And what that means in most jurisdictions with pawn shops, if you bring in a bunch of items, there's kind of a cooling off period where they need to hold on to them before they remit payment to you for a couple reasons. One, obviously, to fully authenticate them, but also to, in the case of pawn shops, they're often needed to check against local police reports of stolen goods. Now, I'm not suggesting that the trade-ins in retro GameStops are necessarily stolen goods, but adopting those rules and those justifications are probably an easier pill to swallow for good good actors and would keep bad actors away, unwilling to trade in counterfeits, knowing that they will not receive payment in any way, shape, or form until all these items are fully authenticated. So food for thought for GameStop here. Again, in the spirit of, I think you're on the precipice of doing this program right. There just needs to be a few little tweaks. So anyhow, GameStop, their retro stuff. A few other details, by the way, in my research. I found that they have made another repricing across the board of the GameStop Retro inventory, and I believe it is identical, both the online prices and the in-store prices. At least that's the finding I saw from comparing some of the price stickers to what they have online. They have now found for some games they're willing to charge more than $99.99 previously, perhaps again as a way to hedge their own potential for getting burned. The max price they were charging for games, no matter what the quote-unquote price charting or book value was $99.99, which meant that you're always forever hoping that you'll have that magical day where an NES Bonk's Adventure will show up online or in your local brick and mortar, and then it's not a fake, and you can score it for $99. So some games we've seen now are up to $109, $119. So while certainly not completely priced to book, the high-end stuff is starting to creep up a little more in the price. The top value for games in terms of what they'll pay still seems to be capped at $35. Again, I believe that's also for their own protection in terms of how much they can get hosed if someone gets a stack of counterfeits through. So that much is kind of similar. And of course, as always, are the things that are truly the amazing, epic items. You pretty much never actually see them available online. I believe in terms of the Pokemon for Game Boy Advance games, I'm of the opinion that there are folks that are botting those in terms of perpetually looking on the site for the availability of those and immediately snapping them up because their prices, while not necessarily yard sale prices, are certainly competitive, and it's the easiest thing you can imagine to resell the Pokemans. So, in summary, I think that from a buyer's perspective, this is a good thing because when you can actually go to a store, a brick and mortar presence, have the tactile experience, you'll know if your game, for example, is complete or missing things or the condition, so on and so forth. And you can request if it's a cartridge to have it opened and looked at to see if it seems authentic. Those are all benefits you don't get from blindly shopping online and praying that you get what you want. However, I still think that GameStop needs to go a little further on training and measures to protect themselves from fraud, because retro games can be a dangerous game if you come across to someone who doesn't know what they're doing. And perhaps we'll check back in a few months as GameStop continues to ramp up inventory, and we'll see. Will we, over the next few months, find some real cool older gems? I guess the only way you're going to know is if you keep an eye on this channel, like and subscribe, and tune on back for the next time that we visit GameStop Retro here on It's All Duggan Games.